I feel at a disadvantage with Yanis as my adversary because not only have I ever tried to run an economy, but sitting here in Islington, he is on his home turf, home pitch, and I'm not. But I'm going to try and defend capitalism, but not the current form of capitalism. Because I'm trained as an anthropologist, and one of the things anthropologists spend a lot of time doing is look at the gap between what people say they do and what they actually do, between rhetoric, between the rituals and symbols they aspire to, and the actual lived reality. And the core of my argument is that the capitalist flag, the flag of Adam Smith that Yanis talked about, has been waved around a lot in recent years by politicians, by business leaders, by financiers, yes, by financial journalists. But what we have today is not what Adam Smith sketched out. To understand that, you have to go back and realize that there are 2 books of Adam Smith, and only one has been focused on in recent years. The Wealth of Nations lays out a theory about why competition is good. I happen to believe, to channel, I hate to say it, Boris Johnson, by quoting Winston Churchill, that actually competition and profit is the worst way to organize an economy except for all the others that have been tried. I say that having lived in the former Soviet Union where I did my research and seen other visions playing out. But when Adam Smith laid out his vision of capitalism, his vision of market forces, he didn't use the word capitalism, his vision of markets, he had 2 books. The Wealth of Nations, about competition and trade, and The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is one of the inspirations for the Moral Money column, which I co-founded at the Financial Times. And that vision essentially argued that there were 4 components you needed to make markets effective. You needed to have free access to markets. People had to be able to take part in them. You need to have free access to prices. People needed to know what the prices were in a transparent way. You needed to have an illusion of ownership between the people who managed ventures and actually owned them, which in Adam Smith's day were mostly family-owned firms, so it wasn't a problem. And you needed to have a shared moral, ethical, and legal base, which basically provided a foundation for people to have shared values and shared trust. Remember, the roots of the word credit come from the Latin to trust. And without that, it's very hard to have a market. Now, if you dial back and think about what was happening 2 decades ago on Wall Street, you can see that all 4 of those components were missing. People did not have equal access to the markets because guess what? It was powerful cartels on Wall Street and the City of London who were running the show. They didn't have access to prices because yes, you can get access to stock market prices, but there's many other prices in finance that are not visible to the wider public. There wasn't effective illusion of ownership and management because guess what? The people who were supposedly owning companies, which is all of us via our pension funds, tended to outsource that to asset managers who were largely asleep at the wheel and didn't understand what was happening inside companies or banks. And there hasn't been a shared moral framework, or even one could argue a legal and ethical framework, essentially putting what's been happening in business and finance into the wider social context. Anthropologists are obsessed with context, obsessed with a sense of consequence of what business and finance does. I would argue that many of those shortcomings are found in other areas of modern capitalism, such as the tech sector, which Yanis just spoke about. I'd actually agree with you that there is a fundamental problem of monopoly power, of a lack of transparency, of a lack of access inside the tech sector as well. And so I would agree with you that capitalism actually isn't particularly effective there at the moment because we don't actually have that at the moment. We have a gap between rhetoric and reality. And yet, I personally still think that that vision of competition, that vision of using profits to be reinvested back in growth, that idea that actually innovation occurs when you have some friction, when you have a sense of personal responsibility, that is still a good set of principles to be using to be driving an economy forward. So, for those reasons, I remain a fan of Adam Smith when you look at both books. And I'll just leave you with two last ideas, which again infuses how I see capitalism, how I'd like to see capitalism play out. As an anthropologist, again, I'm fascinated by words and language. I don't know how many of you know here where the word company comes from originally. I talk about it in my book. It originally comes from Latin, from old Italian actually, con panio, meaning with bread. Because companies were originally seen as groups of people who ate together and then did business together. Similarly, I don't know how many of you know where the word finance comes from, but it actually comes from Old French finir, meaning to finish, which sounds completely bizarre because people think that finance is basically never-ending loops of money going round and round, like sugar in a candy floss maker, building a bigger and bigger puff of speculation. That's kind of meaningless. But originally, finance was about paying off blood debts and finishing actual, tangible commercial transactions. It was a means to an end, not an end in itself. So, to go back to Adam Smith, if you put those two books together, the vision of capitalism that I uphold is one where companies are recognized to be about humans and groups of people competing together, building things together, and money is a means to an end, the fuel that drives forward the economy and growth. And I personally think that is a vision that we should be upholding and aspiring to today. And I just say, last of all, I realized Yanis and I both got the dark blue shirt memo, so we may end up agreeing more than we disagreeing, sadly.
Effortlessly stylish. I thought I'd just pick up a couple of points there to question both of you. Yanis, I was just trying to put together a list in my head, and it's a pretty obvious one, but it goes something like this: Karl Marx, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, Stalin, boo. Any number of post-war communist leaders and supporters after the Great Rift in Europe, of course, in 1939 to 45. 1968, radicalism, Maoism, and on home turf, Jeremy Corbyn. Sort of in illustrious company. You see that the line of argument there is, and each of them has seen the death throes of capitalism in some form. And yet, here we all are having a discussion about whether we can fix it. What makes you think that this time it's different factor applies to 2021?
You're quite right. Every socialist, and I count myself as one, has always been like a stopped clock that eventually tells the right time. We kept predicting a massive financial collapse ever since I was 10, and it happened in 2008. So eventually, all our predictions come true. It doesn't mean we were right analytically about it. Look, why do I think that this time it's different? To quote famous economists. First, I'll repeat some of the things I said, but in a different manner, hopefully, helpfully. Take what happened in the summer of 2020 here in London. I think it was the 12th of August, when you had the announcement that your GDP fell by more than 20% for the first time in the history of British capitalism. Remember that? August 2020. The market expectations were for a fall of about 12 to 13%. It was much, much more than that. And yet 16 minutes later, the London Stock Exchange went up. That has never happened before in the history of capitalism. Why did it happen? For a very logical reason. Because market players thought, oh my God, 20 plus, then immediately, nanoseconds later, they thought, okay, if we're panicking, the Bank of England are panicking. So they're going to print loads of money, and they will pump it in our direction, okay, to refloat the disaster. So let's keep buying. Okay, now, this is simply a little tale that I tell in order to capture the manner in which financial markets have completely decoupled from really existing capitalism. And if you think about it, in 2008, we had a 1929, our generation's 1929. The difference with 1929 was that unlike the Hoover administration in the United States in 29 that let the banks fall, the G7, G20, April 2009, Gordon Brown, London, they decided to refloat them. So they went into a spasm of printing mountain ranges of money to refloat the financial markets, which they did very successfully. Proof that if they want to do something, they do. They do it, right? But ever since they did that, and they did it in a staggered way, the European Central Bank really began doing it in 2012 and then went all out in 2015 with Mario Draghi, 1st of March. But the way I see it now, capitalism has completely been hooked on central bank money. And therefore, why is Jeff Bezos $50 billion richer than he was at the beginning of the pandemic? It's not the profits of Amazon, of his businesses. It is the increase in the share market. Because what happens is, QE means that the central bank prints money, they give it, they effectively give a larger overdraft to the Barclays banks, Deutsche Banks of the world. They look at you people, they say, oh, no, we're not going to lend them because they're hopeless. So they pick up the phone, they call Volkswagen, Siemens, Alstom, Google, Apple, and they say, do you want a few billion? Those people don't need money because they already have stashes of money, which itself is a problem because corporations should be borrowing, not saving. But they take the money because it's free. And they take it and they go to the stock exchange and they buy back their own shares. Okay, so now you have a bifurcation of capitalism. You have the companies that maintain profitability because it's not monopoly that they have. For me, Amazon, General Motors had a monopoly or an oligopoly. Amazon is different. It's a platform. It means that you exit capitalism, you exit the market, and you go into a place where everything that's sold or bought are controlled by one company, one algorithm.
Well,
that is very different.
Let's stick, because there's quite a lot in there, Yanis. Let Gillian come
Okay,
back. Let's stick on that QE, quantitative easing, money sloshing about point.
Just one final phrase.
Then I can throw it over to you.
Yeah, one final phrase.
Competitor.
So, if what I'm saying holds water, then Adam Smith is simply not relevant. He's as relevant as Karl Marx was in the Soviet Union when you were there. In other words, not at all.